I didn't want to hurt them. I only wanted to kill them. That's something that David Berkowitz said. Hey guys, what's up and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, and today we're going to be talking about David Berkowitz, or as he's popularly known as, the Son of Sam. So let's dive into this lovely... Actually, before we dive in, if you're new here, I'm Liz. Here on my channel, I talk about some true crime, and I have the ongoing series of Creating Crime Time. Now, I bet you're probably wondering as to why I used to be called Creating Crime Time, and now it's just Liz Austin. Well, I created this channel with the preface of making art with every single case that I cover, but for me, my art is an outlet. So what I decided to do is just have my name be my name, which is Liz Austin, and then still have the ongoing series of Creating Crime Time here on my channel. That way there is the possibility that one of these cases there might be some art involved. But anywho, again, if you're new here, hey, I'm Liz. I talk about true crime here on this channel. If you want to be a part of this family, if you want to be like one of my supporters and keep listening on, because I upload quite frequently, hit that subscribe button and turn your bell notification on, all that when you know whenever I upload. But anywho, let's get into today's true crime case, shall we? So the lovely David Berkowitz. Well, he was born Richard David Falco on June 1st of 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. His mother, Betty Broder, she grew up in a very poverty-stricken Jewish family, and she was a waitress. She ended up marrying a man named Tony Falco, who was an Italian-American in 1936. And after their marriage of 4 years, Tony ended up leaving her for another woman. In 1950, Betty started a relationship with a married man named Joseph Kleinman, and 3 years later she became pregnant with a child who was known as Richard David Falco, aka David Berkowitz. Well, within a few days of Richard's birth, this is sadly when Betty gave him away. Her reasons for doing so is unknown. Some writers have thought that Kleinman threatened to abandon her if she kept Richard and used his surname for the baby's surname. But honestly, we really just don't know. So, Richard went on to be adopted by Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz of the Bronx. And this couple was a Jewish-American couple as well. And they were owners of a hardware store. And, I mean, they had modest means. And they were childless in their age. And they were about middle-aged, about like 40. They ended up reversing the order of his name, his first name and his middle name, and gave him their own last name. So it ended up becoming David Richard Berkowitz, and he was their only child. So a journalist would reflect on his childhood as being somewhat troubled. Even though he was above average when it came to his intelligence, he lost interest in learning in a very early age, and he became infatuated with petty crimes such as larceny and starting fires. Neighbors and those who are related to him would often remember him being very difficult. He was spoiled and he was a bully. His adoptive parents, too, also consulted a psychotherapist due to his behavior and how he was acting, but the way he behaved never resulted in any intervention when it came to anything legal, and there was no serious mention of his misbehaviors in his school records. He attended 2 different public schools. One is number 123 and one is number 77. That's legit what they are numbered. Yeah. So his adoptive mother would end up dying from breast cancer when he was 14, and his home life became strained during the later years. And this is due to the fact that he did not like his adoptive father's second wife. Not at all. So he lived with his dad while he attended Christopher Columbus High School. He ended up graduating in 1971, and then he would attend college. And they lived in a 4.5-room apartment at 170 Drazer Loop in Co-op City, which is in the Bronx. And this is from 1967 to 1971. So in 1971, when he is 17 years old, David would end up joining the U.S. Army, and he served at Fort Knox in the U.S., and then he ended up going with an infantry division to South Korea. He would be released with an honorable discharge in June of 74, and this is when he located his birth mother, Betty, and he was very distraught because he wanted to know who his real dad was, and she wouldn't tell him. So there was a forensic anthropologist by the name of Elliot Layton who described David's discovery of his adoption and his birth mother as the initial crisis in his life, and it was a revelation that ended up shattering the idea of who he was. Because, I mean, he grew up knowing that his adoptive parents were his real parents, and then he comes to find out that this woman named Betty is his mom, and she won't tell him who his real dad is, you know what I mean? So it's really something that will affect you. And then, that is not all. He would end up communicating with his birth mother, but it would end up lapsing. But he would remain in contact with his half-sister, Rosalind, which probably played more on his mind too. Like, here's this woman that I find out is my birth mother, but yet she put me up for adoption, and then she goes and has another child. You know what I mean? That probably screwed with his mind a lot. So he would end up attending Bronx Community College for 1 year, and this is when he would enroll in the spring of 1975. So in 76, this is when he went to work for a co-op taxi company, and then he would later have several non-professional jobs, and during his arrest, this is when he was working as a letter sorter for the United States Postal Service. So it's during the mid-70s is when David really started committing his violent crimes. His first burglary attempt, or his first attempt at murder, was using a knife and then switching to a handgun. And this definitely started his lengthy crime spree throughout New York, specifically the boroughs of the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. So he sought after young victims, specifically young female victims, and he was more or less attracted to white women with long, dark, wavy hair. That was his thing. That was what he wanted. That's what he really wanted. So all but one of the crime sites that he's involved with have 2 victims. All but one. He committed some of his attacks while women sat with their boyfriends while their car was parked. And he also really enjoyed his activities, and he would often return to the crime scenes after he would commit them. So let's talk about his crimes, shall we? So, David claimed that when he was 22, he committed his first act, and this was on Christmas Eve of 1975, and this is when he used a hunting knife on 2 women in Co-op City. Now, the first alleged victim was a Hispanic woman, and she was never formally identified by the police. The second was a 15-year-old named Michelle Foreman, who was a sophomore at Truman High School, of which he stated that he stabbed 6 times on a bridge near Drazer Loop, and her injuries were serious enough to be hospitalized for a week. David was not suspected in this crime, but he soon relocated to an apartment in Yonkers after this. So flash forward to July of 1976. This is the first shooting that was attributed to the son of Sam, and it occurred in the Pelham Bay area of the Bronx. So at approximately 1:10 a.m. on the 29th of July of 1976, this is when Donna, who is an EMT, she's 18, and her friend Jody Valenti, who was a nurse, who was 19 at the time, are sitting in Valenti's Oldsmobile. Now, they were discussing their evening while they were at, so they were at a place called Peachtree's, which is a New Rochelle discotheque, or basically just a disco. At the time, disco was really popular, and they really liked to get down and boogie. So Gloria opened the car door to leave and quickly noticed that there was a man approaching the car, and she was really startled and angered by the man's appearance and how sudden he was there. And she said, "Now what is this?" This is when he pulled out a pistol from a paper bag he was carrying and then crouched. He braced one elbow on his knee and aimed his weapon using both hands. So he got into a shooter position and then he fired at them. Gloria was struck with one bullet and it killed her instantly. And then Jody Valenti was shot in her thigh. The third bullet missed both of them. This is when the shooter then turned and walked away right after. So Jody survived her injury and she did not recognize this man whatsoever. She described him as a white man in his 30s with a fair complexion, about 5'8", and weighing about 200 pounds. She said that his hair was short, dark and curly in a mod style. This description was repeated by Gloria's father, who claimed to have seen a similar man sitting in a yellow compact car parked near where the crime scene was. Neighbors gave corroborating reports to the police about such vehicle, and that it had been cruising around the area for hours prior to the shooting. So years later is when David admitted in the interview with Maury Terry at Sullivan Correctional Facility that he indeed had shot Gloria and Jody. This happened in 1993, the interview, not the shooting. So fast forward to October of 1976. So on the 23rd of October of 1976, a similar shooting occurred in a residential area of Flushing, Queens, which is next to Bone Park. Carl Denaro, who was a Citibank security guard, he was 20 at the time, and Rosemary Keenan, who was a college student at Queens College, she was 18. They were sitting in Keenan's car. It's when they're sitting in his car when the windows suddenly shatter. Carl said that he felt that the car exploded, and this is when Rosemary quickly started the car and they sped away for help. They were so panicked they didn't realize that somebody had been shooting at them. So even though Carl was bleeding from the bullet, specifically from a bullet wound to his head, Rosemary had only superficial injuries due to the broken glass. So eventually Carl needed a metal plate to replace a portion of his skull because of the bullet, but neither of them saw who attacked them. It was later determined by the police that it was a .44 caliber that shot at Rosemary's car, and this is because of bullets that were embedded in it. So police also thought they were deformed as well, the bullets specifically, and thought it unlikely that they could even be linked by a particular weapon. So Carl had shoulder-length hair at the time, so the police speculated that the shooter had mistaken him for a woman. And Rosemary's father was a 20-year veteran of the NYPD, specifically detective, and this caused an intense investigation because here is a former cop's daughter who was shot at. And as with the case of Gloria and Jody, their shooting, there seemed to not be any motive for the shooting whatsoever, and police made little progress in the case. So there was many details of the shooting that were very similar to the initial one, but police didn't initially associate them together. This is partly due to the fact that they occurred in different boroughs and were investigated by different PDs. So next we're going to the shooting of Joanne Lamino and Donna Demasi. So these two were high school students. Donna was 16 and Joanne was 18, and they both attended Martin Van Buren High School. They were walking home from a movie after midnight on the 27th of November of 1976. So they were chatting, and they were chatting on the porch of Joanne's home in Floral Park. This is when a man dressed in military fatigues, who appeared to be in his early 20s, approached them and asked for directions. So in a high-pitched voice he said, "Can you tell me how to get?" He quickly pulled out his gun and he shot each of them once. and they fell to the ground. He fired several more times, striking the apartment building before he ran away. So neighbors heard the gunshots and rushed out of the apartment building, and they saw a blonde man rush by gripping a pistol in his left hand. Donna, she had been shot in the neck, and the wound ended up being non-life-threatening. However, Joanne was hit in the back, and she was hospitalized due to her serious condition. And ultimately, she became a paraplegic due to this shooting. Our next shooting would happen on the 30th of January of 1977. This happened at about 12:40 a.m. Christine Freund, who was a secretary, she was 26 at the time, was with her fiance, John Deal, who was a bartender, and he was 30. They were sitting in John's car near Forest Hills, the Forest Hills LIRR station in Queens, and they were prepping to drive to a dance hall after having seen Rocky. There was three gunshots that penetrated the car. Now, in a panic, John drove away for help. He suffered minor superficial injuries, but unfortunately, Christine was shot twice and she died several hours later in the hospital. Neither of them saw their attacker. Police first publicly acknowledged that this shooting was similar to earlier incidences that happened and that these crimes might be associated. So all of the victims had been struck with a .44 caliber. The shooting seemed to target young women with long, dark hair. So the sergeant of the NYPD, Richard Conlon, he stated that the police were leaning towards a possible connection in all three of these cases. There were composite sketches that were released of the shooter from the Loria Valenti shooting and then the blonde shooter from the Lamino Demasi shooting. And Conlon noted that the police were looking at multiple suspects and not just one single suspect. At about 7:30 p.m. on the 8th of March of 1977, a Columbia University student named Virginia Voskerichian, she was 19, she was walking home from school when she was confronted by a man who was armed. She lived about a block from where Christine Freund had been shot. So in an attempt to defend herself, this is when Virginia lifted her textbooks between her and her killer to make a makeshift shield. But unfortunately, even though she used it as a shield against the bullets, one of the bullets would strike her in the head, and it ultimately killed her. So on March 10th, 1977, a press conference was held, and the NYPD officials, as well as the mayor, Abraham Beam, declared that the same .44 Bulldog revolver had been fired to shoot and kill Loria and Voskerichian. The official documents were later revealed, however, saying that it was suspected that the same .44 Bulldog revolver had been used in all of the shootings, but that the evidence was actually inconclusive. So this can happen with stray bullets, especially if they were specifically damaged, because they can't fully identify that it's been used in multiple crimes. So these crimes were literally discussed in the local newspaper every day. Circulation dramatically increased for the New York Post and the Daily News. Newspapers often had the graphic commentary of the crimes in the day-to-day newspaper. There were also overseas media that was covering this as well, including page articles in newspapers on the Vatican's Lo Osservatore Romano, and the Hebrew newspaper Mariv, and in the Soviet is Vestia. So this literally went around nationally everywhere. But that's not all for shootings. Oh no, that's not all. So at 3 a.m. on the 17th of April of 1977, Alexander Esau, who was a tow truck operator, he's 20, and Valentina Suriani, who went to Lehman College, she was also an aspiring actress and a model, she was 18, they were sitting in a car belonging to Alexander's brother on the Hutchinson River Parkway service road in the Bronx. And this is about a block from her home and only a few blocks away from the Loria Valenti shooting. So a resident of a nearby building ended up hearing 4 shots, and they called the police. Suriani, who was sitting in the driver's seat, was shot once, and Esau was shot twice, both in the head. Suriani died at the scene, and Esau died at the hospital several hours after. And obviously they died before being able to describe their attacker. So the police said that the weapon used was the same as the ones in the earlier shootings. So on the 23rd of September of 1993, again, like I mentioned before, how David was interviewed by Maury Terry, David also admitted to committing this crime. Soon after, the police discover the bodies of Suriani and Asau. This is when they see a handwritten letter. Now, this handwritten letter, mostly in block capital letters with a few lowercase letters, is addressed to the NYPD's captain, Joseph Borelli. Now, in this letter, this is when David reveals the name of the son of Sam for the first time. So it says, "I say goodbye and good night. Police, let me haunt you with these words. I'll be back, to be interpreted as bang, 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 bang. Ugh. Yours in murder, Mr. Monster." Now, that's the final page of the first letter from the son of Sam. With this letter, obviously the press had previously dubbed him as the .44 caliber killer because of the weapon of choice. But now, because this letter, which was initially withheld by the police, some of its contents were revealed to the press, the name of the son of Sam quickly replaced the .44 caliber killer name. So this letter basically expressed how determined the killer was to continue his work and how he wanted to taunt the police in their efforts to capture him. There's a lot of misspellings in this letter, a lot. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but man, it is great. Especially when he refers to himself as Papa Sam. Like, his dad is Papa Sam, is now old, you know what I mean? He talks about Beelzebub. If you don't know who Beelzebub is, basically it's Satan, or another form of Satan, formerly known as Ekron. But after police get the letter, now they speculated that the letter might, be familiar with a person that's Scottish English, mainly due to the fact that "me hoot, it hurts, sonny boy" kind of seems familiar to that of a person that would speak broken English, especially if they're Scottish. Especially because that, if it's taken into like a Scottish version, it means "my heart, it hurts, sonny boy." So police ended up creating this hypothesis that the shooter blamed a dark-haired nurse for his father's death due to having too many heart attacks, and the fact that Loria was an EMT and Valenti was studying to be a nurse too, that kind of was just like, man, what is this? So technically they are right. He did hate people, so they're not wrong. It's not far-fetched. The killer also had an unusual attitude towards the police, which is something that they never really seen before, and this was received by the media, and it was a widespread scrutiny against the son of Sam. So psychologists also said that many serial killers gain gratification by their pursuers and observers. The feeling of having that control of law enforcement, media, and even the widespread population gives them power. Now, after the police consulted with several psychiatrists, they released a psychological profile on him on the 26th of May of 1977, and this is when he was described as being neurotic and probably suffering as a paranoid schizophrenic, and believed himself to be a victim of a demonic possession, which at this time, man, that's a good profile. Just saying, that's a good profile. So on the 30th of May of 1977, this is when a daily news columnist, his name is Jimmy Breslin, he receives a handwritten letter from somebody who claims to be the .44 caliber shooter. Now, the letter was postmarked earlier that same day in Englewood, New Jersey, but on the reverse of the envelope, so on the back, neatly hand-printed is four very precisely centered lines. And it says, "Blood and family, darkness and death, absolute depravity," and then hyphen 44. Underneath where he signed Son of Sam was a logo or a sketch with several combined symbols. Now, the question that the writer has is, what will you have for July 29th? July 29th is the anniversary of the first shooting for the .44 caliber killer. Breslin then notified police after he received this letter, who thought that the letter probably was somebody with knowledge of the shootings, but the letter was very sophisticated in its wording and its presentation, especially when it's compared to the first letter, which had a lot of incorrect spellings, and it was just the way it was worded was not right. And police suspected that it may have been created in an art studio or a similar profession location, because the person was an expert in printing and calligraphy, or even could have been an expert in graphic design. So the unusual writing also made the police speculate that the killer was a comic lecturer and asked staff of DC Comics whether they knew that writing style and the lettering. So the Wicked King Wicker reference that the police, like in this letter. So basically it says, in their blood and from the gutter, Sam's creation, 44 caliber. Here are some names to help you along. Forward them to your inspector for the use by NCIC. The Duke of Death, the Wicker King Wicker, the 22 Disciples of Hell, John Wheaties, rapist and suffocator of young girls. Yeah. P.S. Inform all detectives working the slayings to remain. So, the Wicked King Wicker. So, that reference caused police to arrange a private screening of The Wicker Man, which came out in 1973, and it was a horror movie. Great movie, by the way. So, the New York Daily News then published this letter a week after. And this is after agreeing with police to withhold some of the portions of text. That way it doesn't scare people. Breslin then urged the killer to end up giving himself up. Obviously, this doesn't happen. So the article that made the day's paper was the highest selling edition of the Daily News to date. More than 1.1 million copies were sold. Police then received thousands of tips. Now, this was based on references of the letter, and all of these tips were useless. So all of the victims to date had long dark hair, and thousands of women in New York then cut their hair or dyed it bright colors. Beauty supply stores had a lot of trouble keeping up with demand for wigs at the time as well because of these shootings, because nobody wanted to die at the hands of the son of Sam. I mean, I wouldn't, but I'm not his MO. So, on the 26th of June of 1977, there's another shooting. Now, this is with Sal Lupo, who is a mechanic helper, he's 20, and Judy Placido, who is a recent high school graduate, she was 17. They had just left Alefa's discotheque in Bayside, which is in Queens. Now, they're sitting in Sal's parked car at around 3 a.m., and this is when 3 gunshots blasted through their vehicle. Sal was wounded in the right forearm, whereas Judy was shot in the right temple, shoulder, and the back of the neck. Both of them survived their injuries, surprisingly. Sal then told police that they had been discussing the son of Sam only moments before the shooting happened. Now, neither of them saw their attacker, but there was witnesses that reported seeing a tall, dark-haired man in a leisure suit fleeing the scene. One claimed to see him leaving in a car and even gave a partial plate number. So on the first anniversary of the 44 caliber shootings, and as it's approaching, the police then established a very big dragnet. Now, if you don't know what a dragnet is, basically it's a system of coordinated measures in order to apprehend people. And this includes barricades and traffic stops and widespread DNA tests and general increased police alertness in different areas. So, however, the next and final shooting of the 44 caliber killer occurred in Brooklyn. Now, these stops that they had were only in Queens and the Bronx. So David picked up on this. So early on, the 31st of July of 1977, Stavey Moskowitz, who was a secretary, and Robert Violante, who is a clothing store salesman, both are 20, they're in Robert's car, which is parked under a streetlight near a city park in the neighborhood of Bath Beach. This is their first date. They were kissing when a man approached them, and he was about 3 feet from the passenger side of the vehicle, and this is when he fired 4 rounds into the car, striking both of them in the head before he ran. Now, a man named Tommy Zano witnessed the shooting, and because of this, Robert lost his left eye, and Stacy, the only blonde victim of David, died from her injuries. So that night, Detective John Falotico was woken up and told to report to the 10th Homicide Division at the 60th Precinct Station House. Now, this is in Coney Island. He was given 2 weeks to work on the Moskowitz Violante case as a normal murder investigation. So, and this was to have it, if it wasn't solved in the time frame, it was to be given to the Son of Sam task force. There's a local resident. Her name is Casilla Davis. She was walking her dog near the scene of the Moskowitz Violante shooting when she saw a patrol officer. Now, this is Michael Cataneo. He's ticketing a car, and this car is parked near a fire hydrant, hence why he's ticketing it. Now, moments after he left, a young man walked past her and from the area of the car and seemed to study her and like be really interested in her. So this is when she felt really concerned because he had something in his hand. It was a dark object. She then ran to her home only to hear shots fired behind her in the street. Now she remained silent about this experience for about 4 days until she finally contacted the police, which I mean, I would be terrified too. They closely checked every car that had been ticketed in that area that night as well. So David's 4-door yellow Ford Galaxy, it was a 1970 model, was among the cars that they investigated. So on August 9th of 1977, this is when James Justice telephoned the Yonkers police department and asked them to schedule an interview with David. They then had the dispatcher who took James's phone call the first time. This was a man named Wheat Carr, this was Wheat Carr, the daughter of Sam Carr, and the sister of David's alleged cult confederates, John and Michael Carr. Whole lot of ness, because I mean, David ends up saying that he's part of Satanic cult. We'll kind of get into that a little bit later. So James asked the Yonkers PD to track down David. Now, according to Mike Novotny, who's a sergeant at the Yonkers Police Department, Yonkers police had their own suspicions about David and with other strange crimes in Yonkers as well, because they saw a reference to basically what they saw in the letters kind of gave them like an itch to investigate David, you know what I mean? Yonkers investigators even told the main detectives for New York City that David might be the son of Sam. So the next day, on August 10th of 1977, this is when they investigate his car that was parked on the street outside of his apartment building on 35 Pine Street in Yonkers. They ended up seeing a gun in the back seat, and when they searched the car, they found a duffel bag. Now, the duffel bag was filled with ammunition, maps of the crime scenes, and threatening letters addressed to an inspector named Timothy Dowd of the Omega Task Force. So police then decided to wait for David to leave his apartment rather than risk a violent encounter with him, specifically because the hallway in the building is very narrow. So they also waited to obtain a search warrant for the apartment as well, because they're worried that their search might be challenged in court. So the initial search that happened on the vehicle was based on the handgun because it was in like visible sighting in the back seat. So although possession of a gun was legal in New York at the time and it required no special permit, they were kind of like, they wanted to be safe because they saw a weapon in the back of a car. They really just wanted to be safe with the way that they apprehend him. So the warrant still had not arrived when David exited his apartment building at about 10 p.m. and entered his car. This is when John Falatico ended up coming up to the driver's side of the car. This is when Falatico pointed the gun at David's temple. And this is also while Detective Sergeant William Gardella pointed his gun from the passenger side at David. A paper bag was found that had a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver, which is the same type that was identified in ballistics tests that they found in David's car. David then flatly said, "Well, you got me." How anticlimactic is that? Well, you got me. So, as described in Son of Sam, that came out in 1981 by Lawrence D. Klausner, Detective Falatico ended up remembering David with a giant smile on his face, like a big giant smile on his face. And this is when Falatico, after he says, "Well, you got me," Falatico says, "Now I've got you. Who have I got?" And then David says, "You know." But the way he says it is super soft and almost a sweet voice. The detective then says back to him, "No, I don't. You tell me." This is when David turns his head and says, "I'm Sam." Falatico asks, "You're Sam? Sam who?" And this is when David Berkowitz says, "Sam." Though there's an alternate version of the first words that were reported of him saying, "Well, you got me. How come it took you such a long time?" Falatico was officially credited as the arresting officer of the Son of Sam. So they then searched his apartment, which is apartment 7E, and they found it in such a disarray. There was satanic graffiti all over the walls. They also found diaries that he had been keeping since he was 21. 3 notebooks, like specifically stenographer notebooks that were nearly full. David had like noted hundreds of arsons and he had claimed to have set throughout New York City. Like, he meticulously kept notes of everything he did. Some people speculate that this number may have been over 1,400 arsons. So soon after his arrest, the building was then changed from 35 Pine to 42 Pine Street in an attempt to end the mass wanting to see where the son of Sam lived. And also, after he was arrested, he was briefly held at the Yonkers police station before being transported to the 60th Precinct in Coney Island. This is where the task force was located. So at about 1 a.m., this is when the mayor arrived to see him personally. And after a brief encounter, which there was no words spoken, he announced to the media, and specifically the people of New York, that you can rest easy because the son of Sam has been captured. So David would then go on to confess on the 11th of August of 1977. He was quick to confess after he was interrogated for about 30 minutes. And he expressed an interest in pleading guilty. So this investigation was led primarily by John Keenan, who took David's confession. Now, during his questioning, David then claimed that his neighborhood dog was one of the reasons why he killed, stating that the dog demanded blood, specifically from pretty young girls. And he said that the name Sam, mentioned in his first letter, was his former neighbor, Sam Carr. David then claimed that Harvey, who is Carr's Labrador Retriever, was possessed by a demon, an ancient one that is, and that it issued irresistible commands and that David must kill people. I don't know about you, but that's fucking crazy. Yeah, I'm gonna listen to a possessed dog that is possessed by an ancient demon. So after a few weeks go by after his arrest and confession, this is when David was permitted to communicate with the press. So in a letter with the New York Post, this was on the 19th of September of 1977, David then talked about his original story of demonic possession and closed with a warning that can be interpreted by some as an admission of criminal accomplices. So he said that there are other Sams out there and God help the world. So at this press conference, another one that happened in February of 1979, David declared that his previous claims of demonic possession was basically horseshit. It was a hoax. David then stated in several meetings with his court-appointed psychiatrist, David Abramson, that he had long contemplated getting revenge via murder, and he felt that he was ultimately rejected, and it hurt him. So there was three separate mental health examinations that determined that he was competent to stand trial. So despite his lawyers, he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, and they wanted him to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, but he refused. And he appeared in court on May 8th of 1978, and he pled guilty to all of his charges. So after about 2 weeks, David caused an uproar when he attempted to jump out of a window on the 7th floor courtroom. He was then restrained, and he chanted, "Stacy," which is his last victim, was a whore, and shouted, "I'd kill her again, I'd kill them all again." So the court ordered another psychiatric evaluation of him before sentencing could proceed. And during the evaluation, this is when David drew a sketch of a jailed man surrounded by numerous walls. And at the bottom, he wrote, "I am not well at all." And David then was found competent to stand trial. So on the 12th of June of 1978, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for each murder, to be served consecutively. So he was also ordered to serve time at the Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York, which is a supermax prison. And despite the prosecutor's objections, the terms of his guilty plea made him eligible for parole in 25 years. Unfortunately. So after his arrest and after his initial confinement to a psychiatric ward in the King's Hospital, where staff reported seeing him troubled by his new environment. On the day of his sentencing, he was taken to Sing Sing, which is and then to an upstate Clinton Correctional Facility for psychiatric and physical examination. There's 2 more months that were spent in Central New York Psychiatric Care Center in Marcy before he was admitted to Attica. David served about a decade at Attica before he was relocated. This happened in 1990. This is when he was sent to Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, where he remained for many years until he was transferred to Shawanagon Correctional Facility in Ulster County. David talked about how his life at Attica was a nightmare. In 1979, this is when there's an attempt on David's life, which left side of his neck, it was slashed from front to back, and it resulted in a wound that needed about 50 stitches to close. He refused to identify who attacked him and claimed that he was only grateful for the attack, and that it seemed to bring a sense of justice. And in his own word, the punishment I deserve. He did end up converting to an Evangelical Christian faith while he was in prison in 1978, and he ended up stating that he no longer wanted to be called the Son of Sam. He wanted to be referred to as the Son of Hope. So David is entitled to a parole hearing every 2 years because it's mandated by state law. Even though he refused to ask for his release, and he would skip hearings altogether. So before his first parole hearing in 2002, he sent a letter to the governor, George Pataki, demanding it be canceled because he does not want to be released. He wrote, "In all honesty, I believe that I deserve to be in prison for the rest of my life. I have, with God's help, long ago come to terms with my situation. I have accepted my punishment." So officials at Sullivan facility rejected his demand. So in 2016 at Shawanagon, David stated that his parole was unrealistic and he felt that he had improved behind bars. He felt that "I am no longer at risk whatsoever." His lawyer, Mark Heller, said that prison staff also considered him to be a model prisoner, and his parole was denied in 2016. So again, in 2018, his parole was denied. His next hearing was scheduled for May 2020, but because of COVID, this was delayed. Well, in 2002, apparently he wrote a letter to the sniper, the DC sniper, to have him stop hurting innocent people. David made his comments on a 3-page letter to Rita Cosby, who was a senior correspondent in Chicago for Fox News, after Cosby wrote him seeking a comment on the sniper attacks. During June of 2005, David sued one of his previous lawyers for misappropriation of a large number of letters, photographs, and other personal possessions of his. Hugo Harmatz, who was a New Jersey attorney at the time, represented David in an earlier legal effort to prevent the National Enquirer from buying one of these letters. Harmatz then published his own collection of the letters and memorabilia called Dear David, that came out in 2005, of which he had obtained from David during their consultations. David then stated he would drop the lawsuit only if the attorney signed over all the money he had made to the victims' families. David and Harmatz settled out of court in October of 2006, and Harmatz agreed to return the disputed items and donate part of his book profits to the New York State Crime Victims Board. So, in 1979, David mailed a book about witchcraft to police in North Dakota. He underlined several passages and he wrote in few marginal notes, including phrases saying Arliss Perry, which Arliss Perry was killed, is another victim, not of his, but of somebody else's, saying Arliss Perry hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California, Stanford University. This is in reference to Arliss Perry, who is a 19-year-old from North Dakota. She was newlywed. She was murdered at Stanford on the 12th of October of 1974. Her death was very notorious because of the abuse of her corpse in a chapel on the campus, and it was widely reported. So David mentioned the Perry attacks in other letters as well, and suggested that he knew details of it from the perpetrator. Local PD interviewed him. As of 2004, believed he was nothing of value. The Arliss Perry case was solved in 2018, by the way. So after his confession or his admission to Sullivan prison, David claimed that he joined a satanic cult in the spring of 1975. And in 1993, David made these claims and announced to the press that he only killed 3 of the Son of Sam victims: Donna Loria, Alexander Asau, and Valentina Soriani. And in his version of the events, he said that David said that he wasn't the only shooter. There was other shooter involved in this case, and that he fired his gun only in the first attack, which is the Loria Valenti attack, and in the sixth, the Esau and Suriani case. He said that the other cult members were involved in the other incidences and were planning events other than those, and that it provided early surveillance of his victims. So David stated that he could not divulge the names of his accomplices without putting his family in risk. Among the unnamed associates was a female cult member who claims fired a gun at De Niro and Keenan, both of whom survived. Now David, because of the alleged accomplice fact, was unfamiliar with a powerful recoil of a .44 Bulldog. David then declared that at least 5 cult members were at the scene of the Fruit Deal shooting, but the actual shooter was a prominent cult associate who had been brought in from the outside and had an unspecific motive. So eventually David would end up naming 2 of these cult members as John and Michael Carr. These 2 were sons of a dog owner named Sam Carr who lived nearby on Warburton Avenue. So there were other theories and beliefs with the satanic cult theory from Donna Loria's father, Carl Denaro, who stated his opinion that more than one person could have been involved, but admitted that he couldn't prove the cult theory as being correct. Ultimately, he concluded that David's statement was completely false. There was no satanic cult whatsoever. They were still really confused when it came to the fact of him continually saying that he was possessed by a demon, and stated that there was a series of 9 videos in 2015 that a voice he heard was that of Sam Hain, who is a Druid devil in the true origin of the son of Sam. He also added it was never a dog, saying that this detail was an absolute fabrication by the media. Obviously, we had skeptics when it came to this case, a lot of them, which included FBI profilers and a lot of different cops who spent time with David. And basically, it just summed it up that a specific profiler, his name is Johnny Douglas, he summed it up as David being an introverted loner, not capable of loving or being involved in a group activity. The psychologist for the NYPD also stated in Against the Law, which is a documentary about the Son of Sam case, that he believes that the satanic cult claims was nothing but a fantasy that was concocted by David to help absolve him of these crimes. In a book, Hunting Humans, Elliot Layton argued that journalistic attempts to abridge or help deny any of his guilt lacked all credibility. So, decades after his arrest, Son of Sam remains recognized as a notorious serial killer. There's definitely many manifestations of this case in popular culture. David continues to express remorse on Christian websites for his crimes as well. Now, Nasa Moskowitz, who previously had not hidden her hatred for David, wrote him a letter shortly before her death in 2006, forgiving him for killing her daughter, Stacy. Now, Moskowitz lost all of her children at young ages. Jody, 9, in a possible suicide in 1968, then Stacy, and then her son Ricky, who was 37, and he died in 1999 from sclerodoma. Sclerodoma. It's a hard word to say. She had no survivors, according to the New York Post, except for her daughter's murderer. So this is why she forgave him. I bet you're wondering what this is based off of, because this whole month has been media driven. And I decided to end it with the Son of Sam because it's something crazy. There's other cases that I wanted to do for this month, but there's things that are coming up in future months that I'd rather have those cases be covered then than now. So there's been different books written in regards to the Son of Sam. Basically, there is a novel called 44 that's written by Dick Shop, and it's in collaboration with Jimmy Breslin, and this is loosely based, it's a highly fictionalized plot that talks about a Son of Sam based character who's named Bernard Rosenfeld. Outside of North America, this book was renamed The Son of Sam, but in the U.S. it's still called 44. There's also a young adult novel called Burn Baby Burn by Meg Medina that's set in New York during 1977, and it depicts the fear of one of the Son of Sam victims and how it affects their daily lives. Now, he's also referred to by Lee Child in Jack Reacher's series High Heat, which is a short novella. Spike Lee had Summer of Sam come out in 1999, which is, he takes the idea of David Berkowitz, like, of what's happening, and it's really good. You need to see it. John Leguizamo's in it, and so is Adrian Brody, and it's Spike Lee wanted to show the ugliness of the past and what was happening, and you really, like, you feel like you're sucker punched in the stomach because of how you feel. So there's other movie portrayals about David Berkowitz. One is by Uli Lommel, which is called The Son of Sam. It was a direct-to-video in 2008. There was also a CBS television movie that came out called Out of Darkness. It came out in 1985. So the character of Son of Sam also was a minor role in a miniseries called The Bronx is Burning that came out in 2007. In the TV series Mindhunter, which is very popular right now, the actor Oliver Cooper played David Berkowitz in an episode as well. So, in 2021, Netflix also released a documentary series called The Sons of Sam, A Descent into Darkness, which goes back into the detail of the satanic cult theory, as well as the journalist Maury Terry and his POV of the investigation. In a Seinfeld episode as well, I know this is weird, in the Diplomats Club, which is an episode of Seinfeld, they use a mailbag of David Berkowitz, who was owned by Newman, as collateral to bet on an airplane. There's a lot of references to David Berkowitz in Seinfeld, which is really weird. In music as well, he's been associated with different songs. One is Psycho Killer by the Talking Heads. The other one is Son of Sam by the Dead Boys. Then there's Son of Sam by Chain Gang, Looking Down the Barrel of a Gun by the Beastie Boys. Chris Calico released an album called Son of Sam in 2013. And then Lucky released an EP called Son of Sam in 2016. There's mentions of him in different songs as well. In Todd Rundgren, his song Bag Lady has references to Son of Sam in it. Billy Joel mentioned these events in the opening line of Close to the Borderline, which is on his album Glass Houses. Scott Putesky used the name Daisy Berkowitz while he played with Marilyn Manson in the 90s. In the band's song Son of Men describes David. Yeah. There's a cartoon composite of David on a breakfast cereal icon, like Toucan Sam, which was featured on the Green Jellies comedy rock video called Serial Killer that came out in 92. And the name of Toucan Son of Sam was later removed because of a copyright lawsuit with Kellogg's cereal. So that, my friends, is the case of the Son of Sam. Again, like I said in the beginning of the video, if you are not subscribed, I highly recommend you subscribe. Turn your bell notification on all, that way you know whenever I upload, as I upload very frequently throughout the week. Now, be on the lookout for next month. I have something very, very, exciting to do next month, and you'll see come May 2nd. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in another video. Bye, guys.